Jack's book, Insurgent Fandom.
I'll tell you that it's really a pleasure to be in a department where you have to split the book party in two because there's too many books being published every year. Also a little bit intimidating, but it's great. Yes, since the late 1990s, we have witnessed the global proliferation of televised sports. This shift has facilitated the emergence of new forms of fandom, ranging from softer fandoms like mine, sporadically following Bayern Munich, Barcelona, Liverpool, or Racing, to devoted remote fans like our colleague Ray Wins, who will religiously wake up in the early hours of the weekend to watch his beloved Leeds United and experience match day as if he were not nearly 4,000 miles away. This transformation has intensified the blurring of boundaries between passion and profit, as corporations have come to realize that it is not in the stadiums, but at home where most of their target consumers are located. Yet, within the stadium, there are hardcore fan subcultures, the ultras, who, as Jack describes, are committed to coordinating crowd action as a means of influencing the result of the game, and who embrace a lifestyle that extends far outside the arena. Max's thought-provoking ethnography shows us how ultras become a bastion of resistance to passive consumerism and the accelerated neoliberal commercialization of sports. Focused primarily on the German and Irish ultra phenomenon, with intriguing forays into both football, soccer, and hockey, Insurgent Fandoms, an ethnography of crowds and unruly sounds, demonstrates how fandom extends far beyond the confines of the stadium, morphing into a potent vehicle for political action. In doing so, Jack speaks well beyond ethnomusicology, making a compelling case for the importance of sound, atmosphere, and affect in social and political life. Positioned at the intersections of sound studies, anthropology, political theory, and sports studies, the book foregrounds hardcore fandom as a practice with real consequences. The book is grounded in long-term immersive fieldwork with three distinct fan communities. I'm going to use the English pronunciation for the German teams because I tried the German and it sounds terrible. My German is horrible. The ice hockey team, EHC Dynamo Berlin or Dynamo Berlin, and the soccer clubs Shamrock Rovers in Ireland and Union Berlin in Germany. Jack's research extends far beyond match-day observations, however. It includes travel with fan groups, hands-on involvement in the production of banners and choreographies, and sustained engagement with the everyday social lives of the ultras inside and outside the stadium. As you read, you encounter the ordinary textures of ultra life. You can imagine Max learning how to paint banners and make flags alongside his interlocutors, or figuring out a choreography using flares that are technically illegal inside the stadium, or uncomfortably trying to sleep on a train to an away match after watching an ultra pull out a graffiti marker and write on the glass of the window. This commitment allows the book to trace how collective feeling emerges through repetition, sacrifice, and through shared love for a team, and how hardcore fandom can exceed the simplistic representation offered by the media, the police, and even scholarship that fixates on violence while ignoring ultras' voices and experiences. In the book's introduction, Jack lays out the, I'm going to call you Max, it's weird. In the book's introduction, Max lays out his intervention by reframing hardcore fandom as a form of crowd action, one that resists passive consumption and foregrounds participation as a practice with political potential, particularly in the formation of grassroots political subcultures. From the outset, he argues that crowd action does not merely express political orientations, but can itself become an enculturating and potentially radicalizing force. Through sound, movement, and coordinated action, ultras cultivate atmosphere, not as a vague background condition, but as a multi-sensory and social process. Atmospheres become both, and Max, I'm quoting you here, the effective discursive terrain that motivates the ultras' primary activities, and a source of public anxiety around ultras, because of their capacity to operationalize mood as a means of coordinating action and vice versa. Part 1 centers on EHC Dynamo Berlin, and examines how, in the context of commercialization and stadium redevelopment, the Black Corner Ultras attempt to preserve alternative styles of fandom that incorporate left-wing politics into crowd action. Chapter 1, Salvaging Fandom, focuses on the political economy of professional hockey, following the team's move to the Mercedes-Benz Arena. Max shows how fans were recast primarily as consumers rather than participants with a tangible influence upon the club's decisions. The new stadium privileged spectacle and passive observation while marginalizing participatory forms of group support in standing terraces, affordable tickets, or collective atmosphere making. Through close attention to sound, to repetition, to bodily exertion, Max demonstrates how ultras distinguish between watching and supporting, sustaining intensity as a way of asserting an alternative vision of fandom. He also introduces a central contradiction of professional sports in which ultras' cultural capital and effective labor enhances the spectacle and the financial value of the club, even as they're treated as disruptive or subversive. Chapter 2, Living with Ghosts, and all the titles of the chapters are fantastic. Living with Ghosts deepens this analysis by situating the Black Corner Ultras within a broader historical and ideological landscape shaped by anti-fascism, post-socialist memory, and the legacy of right-wing extremism associated with the club. Max frames hardcore fans as politicized subjects who learn to feel together through crowd action, while also attending to pragmatism, compromise, and internal disagreement. Failed protests and tensions between left and right-wing factions reveal the fragility of collective cohesion. Here, Max proposes that the political significance of the crowd lies in its capacity to generate new forms of cultural expression and to give voice to those alienated from representative democracy and the erosion of public culture. In this context, the stadium emerges as a valuable, yet contested space that enables connection, communication, and effective relations through which collective participation and expression remains possible. Part 2 turns to Irish soccer club Shamrock Rovers and examines ultras as both a style of crowd action, and an ethos of fandom, particularly in response to the alienation produced by modern corporate football. Chapter 3, Becoming Ultra, opens by showing how the atmosphere cultivated by ultras can create what he calls a heightened experiential terrain, one that helps supporters cope with poor results, with club's financial crisis, and even the death of a member of the community, By approaching ultras not as a stable category, but a historically grounded practice, Max traces the emergence of a contemporary Shamrock Rovers ultra style that, in an effort to move away from British fan culture, selectively appropriates chants, rhythms, and aesthetics from Italy and Argentina. This produces a continuous and immersive environment through a dense set of ethical and aesthetic choices about fashion, about songs, movement, choreographies, pyrotechnics, and relationships with the state, the police, with club administrators, and the commodification of the sport itself. Ultra practice comes into being and circulates transnationally. Chapter 4, Alienation and Dissent, extends this analysis by examining how Irish ultras respond to the corporatization and global marketing of football. The chapter foregrounds ultras' rejections of consumer identities to the point that some abandoned highly commercialized teams in favor of clubs that allow greater participation and less policing. Here, fandom emerges as a mode of dissent, grounded in feeling, in continuity, and in collective action. Crucially, the chapter shows how this does not function as a rational, critical discourse, Max's words, but instead relies on expressive practices, such as chants, graffiti, pyrotechnics, and inflammatory references to violence. Through these practices, ultras articulate broader critiques of the media, of the governing bodies, and the state. Part 3 returns to Berlin and focuses on FC Union ultras in relation to governance, to policing, and to the state. Chapter 5, Imagining Democracy, presents crowd action as a practice through which participants imagine and enact alternative politics of space and belonging. Max shows us how FC Union has retained a community's ethos and traditions that distinguish it from other clubs, treating fandom as a community-based social practice, rooted in historical connections to the GDR and to East Berlin, before the fall of the wall. What stands out most is how political attunement is channeled through Ultras' experience in modulating the atmosphere in the stadium and cultivating and coordinating affective dispositions. Chapter 6, Affective Governance, analyzes the relationship between atmosphere, surveillance, and state power. Max shows how Ultras imagine and enact democratic practices through emotionally intimate forms of collective action while facing increasing securitization, militarized policing, and media-driven moral panics. Governance strategies aimed at managing risk often intensify the very tensions they seek to contain, generating paranoia, antagonism, and heightened affective intensity. Max shows us that Ultras respond by strategically shaping mood by deploying banners and flares and using atmosphere as a form of political commentary that operates outside conventional debate. As he notes, protest here is not about convincing the unconvinced, one of my favorite sentences in the book. It's not about convincing the unconvinced, but about performing for and incorporating participants into an alternative vision of the world that rings true. Finally, Chapter 7, Until the Last Breath, concludes with a reflexive assessment of the limits and the possibilities of ultra fandom. Max reflects on the unevenness of his ethnographic axis and the risk that researchers become implicated in regimes of governance themselves. He situates ultras with ongoing frictions among capitalism, with the media, and with the state, and emphasizing that their persistence is tied not just to resistance, but to their role as producers of effective value. Insurgent Fandom is an ethnographically rich, intellectually generous, and theoretically ambitious book that makes a significant contribution across multiple fields. By centering atmosphere, affect, and participation, Max Jack offers a powerful model for studying collective life that resists simple binaries of resistance or co-optation. This is a work that will resonate widely with scholars of sound, politics, and social movements. It certainly has resonated with me. Congratulations to Max on an outstanding field-shaping contribution.
The next book we are going to celebrate is Esu-Elegba's Crossroads, Transcultural Creativity in the Works of Femi Euba, by the first of two books by Solimar and Mayer-Garcia. So, and the person talking about the book is our own Rebecca Dirksen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is my privilege to continue our Spring 2026 book party with a warm invitation to consider the volume Esu-Elegba's Crossroads, Transcultural Creativity in the Works of Femi Euba, edited by our own Mayer-Garcia and Solimar Otero. This compact yet rich collection of interdisciplinary essays and testimonials is offered in honor of the acclaimed Nigerian-American playwright, theorist, and director Femi Euba, and deepens scholarship on African drama, performance theory, and diasporic creative practices. The contributors include some of today's most eminent scholars, scholar artists, and practitioners of West African expressive and spiritual culture, hailing from disciplines including comparative literature, theater history, English, folklore, and gender studies. Published by Routledge in 2025, this 8-chapter volume emerged from a 2022 special issue of the journal Atlantic Studies, and before that a conference titled Praise at the Crossroads, Cultural Intersections in Literary and Artistic Works, hosted in 2014 by Louisiana State University School of Theater. The work takes Esu, or Esu-Elegba, the Yoruban deity of the crossroads and the trickster spirit with whom Euba aligns himself, as a primary organizing metaphor to work through the many dimensions of the playwright's oeuvre. Equally, though, is the positioning of Euba, and implicitly all assembled authors, within literary giant Wole Soyinka's circle, or more fittingly, as the co-editors suggest, house, after the Yoruban social unit of Ile, through a relational engagement beyond a mentor-mentee rapport that Mayer-Garcia and Otero call generational thinking. Notably, Notably, the Nobel laureate was present at the 2014 conference and joins this volume through a transcribed conversation from that event between himself, Euba, and their fellow Nigerian intellectual, the cultural theorist Biodun J. Fo. The three elder statesmen of theater, all born in Nigeria within the same generation but a few years apart, reminisce on their early interactions compelled by involvement in the senior Soyinka's theatrical endeavors in the 1960s and 70s Ibadan. This period leading up to the Nigerian Civil War and after Soyinka's release from prison saw Soyinka pull both his compatriots into his world of theatrical production, initiating a lifelong exchange. This period that the editors would have us understand set the foundations for generational thinking and intellectual closeness that germinated in apprenticeship and blossomed into enduring collaboration. And as contributor John Wharton Lowe put it, Euba's, quote, time in Wole Soyinka's legendary theater company was the incendiary fuse that lit intellectual explosions. Setting the reader out on their journey through the text, Mayer-Garcia and Otero write in their introduction, quote, as Eshu and Ogun are brothers in opening the roads of destiny, so too are Euba and Soyinka brothers in creating art that challenges paradigms of racial and cultural inequality, end quote. In fact, I would amend that statement based on my reading of the whole text, I suspect with little resistance from either co-editor, to assert that this pair of artist intellectuals in particular have gone well beyond matters of racial and cultural inequality to challenging paradigms of power, corruption, and post-colonial chaos, an articulation Soyinka has been apt to use, as well as the forms and cosmological functions of theater and ritual themselves. And while Euba long ago took Eshu as his muse, Soyinka's work takes Ogun, the Orisha of iron war and hunting, a destructive creative unity, and a pathfinder who clears obstacles for those who follow, as intervention, archetype, and the structural base for his art. This alignment renders the brotherhood between the two figures mystically bound, situating their relationship on a cosmic level. Just who is Femi Euba, the central pillar of this tome? Now the seasoned age of 86, Dr. Euba is the Louise and Kenneth Kinney Professor of Black Drama and Playwriting at LSU in Baton Rouge, with a joint appointment in the Department of English and the School of Theater. A transnational figure born in Lagos, educated in Africa, the United Kingdom, and the United States, Euba has forged a distinctive career that traverses continents and intellectual traditions. A committed innovator and a probing satirist, Euba's work is deeply informed by Yoruba cosmology, ritual performance, satire, and a sustained engagement with modern theater practices. His creative output includes the novel Camwood at Crossroads, the plays The Gulf and The Eye of Gabriel, and the books Archetypes, Imprecatures, and Victims of Fate, Origins and Development of Satire in Black Drama, as well as Poetics of Creative Process and Organic Practicum to Playwriting, and Experiencing WS, that is, Soyinka, whose initials are shared with, of course, William Shakespeare, all of which figure into this book's critical analyses. Through the writings assembled here, a portrait emerges of a creative thinker whose career has intertwined theatrical innovation with philosophical engagement across cultural boundaries. The reader learns that a young Euba, serving as a stage assistant, once watched yearnfully from the sidelines as Soyinka directed rehearsals for his play, A Dance of the Forests. Euba was nudged along his theatrical path when he ventured to read a part that the director himself was reading, and did so convincingly that Soyinka replaced himself with a younger, then inexperienced actor. And that, years after Euba was established as an artist and a cultural theorist, for a long time he insisted on his apolitical stance as a writer, only to recognize many years later that his work bore a profound political consciousness through and through. From this personal reckoning, he developed an explicit commitment to a politics of creativity. The political is embedded in creativity, not the other way around, he has declared. The reader also observes that, having resided in Lagos, London, and Louisiana, and several other locales across 3 continents, in his plays and creative fiction, Euba has wrestled with and delighted in overlaying worlds and perspectives and temporal moments as he works through the wounds carved by racism and neocolonialism, as well as the frictions caused by grinding modernity set against, again in Lowe's terms, ancient cultural values, rituals, and concepts of community. Euba is as at home producing Shakespeare, The Tempest is among his greatest triumphs, as he is African theater. By his own telling, he sees echoes of Shakespeare's fools, braggarts, and petulant servants in the characters that populated the streets of the Lagos he knew growing up. And perhaps more importantly, that satire is deemed a tool more critical than tragedy. It has more bite, more honesty, and more destructive yet therapeutic potential. A sense of Euba's praxis emerges as well, resonating with broader questions in post-colonial and performance studies. How do performance and ritual shape cultural memory? How can theater systems articulate epistemologies that resist colonial impositions? How does one theorize creativity in contexts of diaspora, hybridization, and cultural flux? This volume responds to these prompts by treating Euba's body of work as a site of transcultural inquiry instead of as text to be merely decoded. Rather than seeing his work as a simple product of a single tradition, contributors to Esu-Elegba's Crossroads explore how his practice embodies the dynamic interplay of tradition and innovation, ritual and dramaturgy, cultural rootedness and global exchange. In this sense, Euba is less a contained artistic subject and more a node of intersectionality, a crossroads figure in his own right. Positioned in Atlantic studies alongside his friends and interlocutors Henry Louis Gates, Paul Gilroy, and Stuart Hall, he is an astute reader of African American and Caribbean literatures as well. Attending to texts by Lorraine Hansberry, James Baldwin, Derek Walcott, Edward Glissant, Aimé Césaire, and especially Amiri Baraka, through whose writings he witnesses signs and articulations of Eshu. For all the crossings born in the rituals and performances and recountings that traverse and tie up the Atlantic Ocean, and for all their relevance to negotiating life in a contemporary world, however, Euba laments that globalization has meant that he and other emigre artists like him remain comparatively unknown in the West. That process, he says, quote, supposedly should operate as a kind of two-way system in terms of its receptivity, but it is often merely an ideal, at least for the African. And still he stands firm, writing between cultures. With regard to the structure and scope of the contributions herein, following the editorial introduction, 8 chapters come, encompassing assessment of at least a dozen writings by Euba and Schwenka combined, with concerns ranging from identity and belonging, to political violence and traumatic experience, to spiritual transformation and regeneration, all told through allegories, aborted rituals, choreographed bodies, and comparative frameworks. Olo Osagi's essay on Femi Euba's play Tortoise examines how the classic Yoruba trickster tale and Schwenka's unjust imprisonment inform Euba's treatment of narrative, satire, and cultural allegory. Biodun Fo's chapter brings together poetics, politics, and epistemology in an analysis that underscores how Euba's work destabilizes conventional narrative forms and insists on performance as a site of political and cultural contextation. Mayer-Garcia's contribution titled Eshu's Crossroads and Ogun's Crossing Over prioritizes Euba's theory of the drama of epidemic, elaborating on the implications of intercultural creativity and post-colonial futurity in Euba's theater. Omofalabo Ajayi Schwenka focuses on ritual archetypes that underpin Euba's encouragement of her choreographic sensibilities in a production of Schwenka's Death and the King's Horseman at Kalamazoo College, revealing how carefully calibrated movement and its interaction with the text bring about a connection between the play and its audience. Agnes Dengerville examines Euba's novel Camwood at Crossroads, which considers the significance of the West African shrubby tree, the symbolic association of the vegetal trope, and its use as a hermeneutical tool to reflect on Black fate and Black identities in the Atlantic world. John Wharton Lowe provides a testimonial as a colleague as interested in Euba's personal life and friendly interactions as his creative writing, theater making, and literary criticism. He reflects on myth, performance, and creative achievement through Euba's work, offering a synthesis that bridges critical history and aesthetic appreciation. The conversation among Euba, Shoenka, and Jayfo follows in a dialogic mode and reminiscent style rarely seen in volumes of this type, providing readers with first-hand insight into the intellectual and creative rapport that shaped Euba's career. The final chapter features Euba's own reflections on the benefits and irritations of globalization and his career as a, quote, participating emigrant playwright, bringing a personal voice to the theoretical discussions that precede it. In conclusion, Esu-Elegba's Crossroads stands as a compelling contribution to both African theater scholarship and transnational performance studies. Through a thoughtful editorial framing and a diverse set of contributions, Mayer-Garcia and Otero present Professor Femi Euba not merely as a playwright and theorist, but as a conceptual agent of transcultural creativity. While this volume is presented as a tribute to Euba, Wole Soyinka's presence simmers throughout. Arm in arm, the editors relay, Euba and Soyinka both, quote, reinvent global theater with a sting that makes us laugh and cry. Really, who could pass on an opportunity to take up a place in this audience, to engage in the play of participation, as Mayer-Garcia invokes from Margaret Thompson Druell, in an effort to ignite our artistic imaginations toward constructing post-colonial futurities that refuse the many violences of contemporary times. Thank you both.
The next book we're going to fet here is called Emerging Perspectives in the Study of Folklore and Performance. Solimar, Otero, David McDonald is going to present. Do you want to sit or you're okay?
No, I'm okay. I'm going to sit on that table.
No, no, come on. I'm kidding.
Oh, no, don't sit.
Cross-legged.
All right. If you'll forgive me, I'm going to lean, if that's all right. It makes it a lot easier for me.
Do you want that chair? That tall one?
No, I'm fine. Okay. I'm going to put the text right here. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you all. I just want to point out before I start, by my count, this is Soli's 4th book since she got to IU.
Wow.
I hate you. Seriously.
You've got lots too.
I'm sending you my therapy bill.
It's a very stimulating environment.
Yes, it is. Congratulations. Okay, it is a genuine pleasure, a scholarly joy, to gather here in celebration of this book, Emerging Perspectives in the Study of Folklore and Performance, edited by our own Solimar Otero and Anthony Bocco-Gatelli. From its introduction, this volume sets out to accomplish something both bold and generous. It reclaims performance, not as a closed chapter in folkloristics, not as a theoretical fashion that has run its course, but as a living, unsettled, and urgently necessary framework for thinking with culture, tradition, and everyday life. In the foreword, friend of the department, Charles Briggs, lovingly labeled this volume a long-awaited kick in the pants. A kick in the pants in the process by which performance has been reified and stagnated into rigid disciplinary canons, graduate reading lists, which I'm sure you all have, and obligatory literature reviews. At its heart, this edited volume makes a critical intervention into how we reinvigorate the connections between folklore and performance studies. Those connections that were once hallmark of the early performance turn in the 1960s and 70s. This intervention is pursued not nostalgically, nor as an update to a settled canon, but rather by rethinking premises, modes of analysis, and scholarly intention amidst contemporary worlds and university campuses, shaped by colonial afterlives, racialized embodiment, gendered and sexual subjectivities, digital mediation, protest, pleasure, memory, and trauma. Charles Briggs goes on to note that intersectionality and critical race theory, queer theory, and spiritual and material agencies, they challenge the assumptions, subjects, and subjectivities that were often implicit in our initial formulations of performance, the things we didn't see at the time. By focusing on contemporary bodies of scholarship, Soli and Anthony remind us that while the so-called performance turn emerged in the 1970s, performance itself has never stopped turning, expanding outward from marked events into everyday life, from stages to streets, courtrooms, coffee houses, sports arenas, archives, digital worlds, and physical landscapes. This is where the book's intent becomes especially clear. Soli and Anthony are not simply revisiting performance, they are revitalizing a dialogue between folklore and performance studies, a dialogue that folklore helped to originate but has not always been credited with sustaining. Figures like Del Himes, our own Dick Bauman, Roger Abrams, Dan Venamos, Henry Glassie, Americo Perez, BKG, and Beverly Stolci, some of my favorites, they fundamentally reshaped how scholars understood expressive culture. These mentors insisted that folklore was not simply text or artifact, but situated action, framed, emergent, interactional, social. They emphasized context, competence, audience, evaluation. They showed that meaning doesn't arise in words and objects or genres, but in ongoing generative acts of performance itself. So what this volume makes clear is that folklorists' many contributions to performance didn't wane in the 80s. Folklore's attention to tradition as dynamic practice, to everyday life as meaningful action, and to marginalized expressive forms has made it uniquely positioned to engage performance scholarship. The folklorists among us, in this room even, have long recognized that performance is a key mode through which communities transmit knowledge under conditions of dispossession, erasure, and surveillance. Performance is a way of remembering what cannot be safely archived. That one hit me strong. That performance is a way of sustaining relationships to land, ancestors, and community when dominant institutions deny their legitimacy. And folklorists have shown how performance unsettles those normative transcripts of gender, sexuality, and kinship, and how expressive practices create spaces of possibility. These engagements do not abandon Dick Bauman's initial insights. In fact, they deepen them, and pushing performance theory towards more complex understandings of affect, embodiment, and belonging. This intellectual lineage brings us right back home to Bloomington, Indiana, whose IU's Department of Folklore has, and its influence is woven throughout the pages of this volume. Indiana has long been a central site for theorizing folklore and performance, and this volume is a multi-generational affair. From Dick and Beverly's foundational works, cited in nearly every chapter, and upon the 50th anniversary of Dick's landmark publication, Verbal Art as Performance in 1975, an American anthropologist, I recognize at least 3 subsequent generations of IU scholars in this work. One of the great joys of reading it, for me in fact, was getting to know the work of my colleagues, former students, and alumni who have each sought to extend and elaborate on the training they provided or received in our classrooms. So forgive me if I dwell a moment on the contribution of our IU colleagues. For example, Eric's brilliant chapter, in my opinion, called Contested Ancestors, is easily one of the most important essays of the collection by providing a crucial decolonial intervention that recenters Afro-diasporic and Caribbean theorists, showing how everyday life has long been theorized beyond Goffman's Eurocentric canons, and demonstrating that performance theory has room for growth by integrating perspectives from a broad range of constituencies. Sarah Gordon, one of our former graduate students, now at Memorial, a lesser institution, John, wouldn't we say? She reframes ethnography itself as a performance, foregrounding queer temporality, reflexivity, and the ethics of discomfort. What I love about her chapter is that she offers a deeply personal, a humble, and vulnerable reflection on ethnographic methods and the heteronormative expectations that undergird the dissertation research process. Every graduate student needs to read this chapter. Similarly, Soli's deeply personal, equally humble exploration of performance, how performance functions as a material and sensorial practice through which ancestors are actively animated rather than merely remembered, points to how our bodies become conduits of memory, grief, and continuity. Gestures, sounds, rhythms, and tastes create possibilities for world-making and for sustaining relationships across time, space, and even death. And here I want to point to Ray's work on the hungry grass and Rachel's work on the mascleta, and that correlates as compadres to this kind of phenomenon of multi-central embodied archival practices, or even taste becomes a means of connecting to the other world. Lisa Gilman's chapter offers a sophisticated framework for analyzing power and performance through musical activism. Building on Beverly's incredible work, Lisa shows how performance in protest contexts, such as a veterans' anti-war coffee house, simultaneously reproduces and contests hierarchy. Her insistence on holding contradiction at the center of performance analysis reflects folklore's long-standing refusal of simple binaries between resistance and domination. Taken together, all of these essays offer us an invitation to folklorists and performance scholars alike to think with performance again along new conceptual terrain. Just as the folklorists of the 70s proposed new ways of understanding performance as a heightened mode of communication, one that makes social relationships available, accountable, and consequential, Soli, Anthony, and their collaborators invite us to similarly rethink notions of performance and craft new approaches. In doing so, emerging perspectives in the study of folklore and performance accomplishes its primary objective: to reinvigorate the conversation among folklorists and performance scholars along new terrain. And with this, I would add that Soli and Anthony have invited us to rethink the fundamental premises of performance theory by deepening our understanding of the body and by foregrounding the scholar's humble participation, collaboration, and ethical responsibilities. So in that spirit of celebration, please join me in congratulating Soli and all of the IU collaborators, Eric, Sarah Gordon, Greg Hansen, Katie Borland, Lisa Gilman, and Lisa Gabbard. It really is a family affair, for publishing such a timely and significant contribution to folklore and performance studies. Congratulations, and thank you for your vision, your generosity, and your commitment to IU folklore.
Is David McDonald's own festival activism, Jenna Sears, will be presenting. So thank you, Jenna.
Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald, for inviting me to speak on this wonderful edited volume. One of my favorite things about edited volumes is that they weave a variety of voices, case studies, and theoretical threads into a wide-ranging dialogic mosaic. Edited volumes inherently allow space for different perspectives, time spaces, and orientations that build up a cartography bound by common concept, experience, or value. It is my privilege to spend the next few minutes mapping some of the threads and voices dispersed through festival activism, as the edited volume contends with how festivals and festivities, quote, are mobilized for political intervention, end quote. Edited by David McDonald, Andrew Snyder, and Jeremy Reed, festival activism stands out for its illustrating ethnographies of cultural festivals varying in location, size, and function. Each chapter is threaded through the titular notion of festival activism, which changes shape and direction through the various ethnographic case studies, broadly positing activism as a combination of, as McDonald, Snyder, and Reed write, quote, postures and practices aimed at intervention in and transformation of the social and political order, end quote. The authors ask to what effect festivals may serve as tools and settings for political intervention. With 12 contributing chapters, an introduction, and an afterwards, festival activism deploys a vast array of ways in which cultural festivals can implicate themselves in political stakes. When I asked Dr. McDonald what he was most proud of through the edited volume, he mentioned that this book is a result of a collaboration between IU Department Folklore and Ethnomusicology faculty and graduate students, and highlights contributing authors from a dearth of different cultural practices and positionalities, including folklorists, ethnomusicologists, and public arts practitioners. While there are many chapters that focus on musical festivals, such as McDonald's chapter on Palestine Music Expo and Snyder's chapter on accessibility in Rio de Janeiro's Carnival, in addition to Eric Fillon and AJ Havlitz's afterwards on why music festivals matter, many of the case studies focused in this book also focus on theater, dance, and ritual practice, providing context for how various artistic mediums negotiate and deploy political purposes. Within the introduction, McDonald, Snyder, and Reed direct us to 4 key resources for political action in festival activities: participatory action, pleasure, assembly, and appearance. They argue that these resources can, quote, manifest through various tactics of intervention such as disruption, refuge, renewal, deliberation, and futurity. These tactics, McDonald, Snyder, and Reed use as subsections to organize the subsequent chapters throughout the volume. One of the most compelling features of the introduction and the editorial thread throughout this volume is the way that these tactics can spark different types of political action. As McDonald, Snyder, Reed, and other authors within this volume state, the political potential of festival spaces does not always lead to progress, but rather could be a means to conform and or align with political regimes. However, each festival space denotes a web of local and transnational sets of conditions that prompt how political action is engaged. The introduction orients us to the complex negotiation of needs, access, values, and objectives that are contained and mobilized within festival spaces. The first section, Disruption, includes chapters from authors Deontay L. Harris and Filippo Bonini-Boraldi. Deontay L. Harris talks about creating a public Black political consciousness during the Notting Hill Carnival in London, asking, what can analyses of Carnival arts in London reveal about the contemporary freedom dreams of Black Britons today? Harris argues that through the Notting Hill Carnival, artists such as visual artist Ishmael Blackgrove can use public infrastructure such as the streets to create, quote, an interactive gallery to reconstruct power relations that exist between themselves and white attendees in the London Carnival space, end quote. After Harris's chapter, Filippo Bonini-Boraldi examines the notion of relational geometries of music festivals, writing that, quote, the standardization of listening habits, of the musician-spectator relationship, of the space and duration of musical performances are all the consequences of a logic of power and profit, which generates distances and hierarchies rather than encounters and equities, end quote. Boraldi provides examples from musical events called the Balls of Diversities organized across the EU to challenge the mechanisms of decision-making and organization developed in these musical events. He ultimately argues that polymusical, dissensual, and heterogeneous co-action in these festival spaces, quote, allows us to exist in multiple ways, free to be transformed by the action of others, end quote. The second section, Refuge, contains chapters that expand, explore, and challenge notions of accessibility, belonging, and inclusion within festival spaces. In his chapter, Andrew Snyder talks about how inclusion is negotiated through the blocos in Rio de Janeiro's Carnival traditions. Snyder focuses on Orquestra Violada, an accessibility group that strives to reevaluate how people with disabilities can participate in blocos. Snyder distinguishes between accommodation, which he argues focuses on individualized needs, and access, which he provides as a structural change making a space accessible without the request of a single person. By challenging the times of blocko, the physical space that blocko is performed in, and by counteracting ableist pedagogies in music education, Orquestra Violada creates not only physical and infrastructural accessibility, but also, quote, attitudinal accessibility, which aims to shift the responsibility for accommodation from the individual with the disability to the collective culture's concern with reducing barriers to access, end quote. Also within this section, Louise Barriere recounts how DIY music, lyricism, and costuming navigate the various ways that gender, race, and labor are entangled within feminist music during the Lady Fest music. The third section of this book, Renewal, includes authors Jenny Gubner, Jeremy Reed, Seren Hulela, and Miguel Muniz. These authors deliberate on the way that cultural practices and festivities can be repurposed, reoriented, and respatialized. Jenny Gubner positions grassroots tango festivals as an aesthetic space that localizes and reclaims neighborhood cultural traditions to counteract the sentiment that tango is a national and cultural export from Buenos Aires. She illustrates the ways that artists and organizers deliberately position grassroots tango as a reaction to the negative effects of neoliberal cultural policies. Additionally, Jeremy Reed and Seren Hulela point to how grassroots theater offers different possibilities in Jordan's public spheres, in contrast to some of the other state-produced festivals, quote, which are premised on the optics of political spectacle and tourism, end quote. Focusing on Al-Balad theater and its use of urban street art, music, and storytelling, Reed and Hulela argue that this festival space is a site of intensive, intentional communal experience that shapes individual and collective identities and their relationship to place. Finally, Miguel Moniz writes about how cultural parades and festa carry a historical and political lexicon tied to Portugal's dictatorship. However, Moniz continues by highlighting the way these performative frames have been repurposed to, quote, communicate progressive aims, focusing on the way Portuguese philharmonicas have mobilized rather than abandoned cultural forms, end quote. The fourth section, Deliberation, begins with Jane Nissen's exploration of the World of Music, Arts, and Dance, WOMAD Festival, a transnational festival against ecological destruction. Nissen argues that, quote, festivals like WOMAD can challenge complacency and mobilize collective action. He also writes that many artists use WOMAD as a space to advance a politics of transnationalism, but also allow for sonic agency in the musical performances, where by coming together, these performances and musical protests can disrupt complacency and mobilize participants to get involved in transnational activism beyond the festival itself. Following this chapter, Ruthie Meadows engages how festivals offer practitioner and ritual musicians novel spaces of academic ritual assertion. Focusing on Nigerian-style Ifa and the Festival del Caribe, participants, quote, collapse the purported boundaries between ritual praxis and academic study in Afro-Cuban religion, end quote. Finally, Oladele Orarinde writes how jazz festivals have advanced social justice in post-apartheid South Africa, quote, where jazz becomes crucial in the nation's social transformation, end quote. Focusing on the Cosmology Jazz Festival, Ayarinde argues that grassroots jazz festivals challenge the boundary between practitioner and audience to reconstitute how knowledge is produced and valued in these festival spaces. Finally, the volume concludes with the fifth section, Futurity, which highlights alternative modes of being and thinking within festival spaces. This section ends with Kimberly J. Marshall and Stephen Hatcher's attending to the limitations and perils of multiculturalism within a settler-colonial context in festivals. Marshall and Hatcher review some of the ways that the Boise, Idaho World Village Festival contribute to what they call an expressive culture of erasure, where well-meaning attendees participate in cultural essentialization and mimesis. However, Marshall and Hatcher offer trickster activism as a method that renegotiates performance as an educational mode to foster heterotopia and mock and trick settler-colonial frameworks. Preceding this chapter, David McDonald's chapter focuses on the 2019 Palestine Music Expo, PMX, in Ramallah, and the activist potential of festival practice. He argues that PMX, quote, provides a platform for disruptive and transgressive performance within a political field defined by intense vulnerability, end quote, where the festival disrupts the status quo and offers refuge to performers and participants. McDonald writes that, quote, to sing, to dance, to celebrate, and imagine, all are politically charged acts of intervention against a field of appearance that denies or dismisses Palestinian presence. PMX mobilizes festival practice as a mechanism of appearance, and therefore a form of direct action against the occupation, end quote. Using Lisa Marie Cacho's notion of social death, McDonald argues that PMX, viewed through the lens of Palestinian dispossession, opens crucial spaces for engaging the limit beyond the limits of the present moment. McDonald continues stating, quote, PMX seeks to mobilize Palestinians as visible, legible, knowable subjects for various internal and external logics, and create spaces for seeing and hearing Palestine beyond the logic of elimination. In the chapter, McDonald offers us the notion of festival futurity as a politically desired alternative that uses the festival to create a future the present has yet to acknowledge, as well as the spatial, logistical, and material resources required to experience the future in the present. By providing safety for transgressive performance, prioritizing joyful affect, solidarity tours, and workshops for international delegates, PMX embeds desires for self-determination within a celebration of Palestinian creativity. These actions can inspire hope, and as McDonald writes, quote, where there is hope, there is greater possibility for sustained political action, end quote. This edited volume produces a rich map of cultural practice, public imagination, and political action. It is a reminder that festival spaces are often a catalyst for political reflection and can bring individuals together to ignite collective response. I'm very excited to see how scholars build on these contributions to further conversations on festival activism. and how it is witnessed and applied throughout ethnomusicology and beyond. Congratulations to Dr. McDonald and all contributors in this wonderful edited volume.